Each year, the Historical Society publishes a journal called Chabako that includes a series of articles about island history. However, in 2021, the Society wanted to try something different and instead is focusing this edition on some very important historic records in our collection, wanting to share them directly with a wider audience. The records are in a series of logbooks that were written between 1880 and 1890 by a group of students from Harvard, and they recorded observations about the natural and social environments of the island. Calling themselves the Champlain Society, the young men documented plants, insects, birds, climate, seawater, and more. Their entries reflect their love of this island as they tromped through the forests, their awe of its natural charms as they discovered bioluminescence, and their sense of playful adventure as they tease one another about strength and stamina. It's rare for these kinds of historic records to capture humor or the personality of the authors, but I found that I often laugh as I read their accounts as they tease one another through their journals. Catherine Schmitt, who is editor of this special edition of Chabako, will talk more about the Champlain Society shortly. So I will only add that as wonderful as these logbooks are, I wondered why publishing them was important. The Mount Desert Island Historical Society believes that history matters. So as I sat with these logbooks and I thought about why they matter, it occurred to me that we have much to learn from the science that's captured within their pages. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges our world faces, but to understand change, both the scope and the speed, we have to look to the past. We need to know what was here to know what is new and what is gone. So inspired to use this history to explore the impacts of climate change, I reached out to 5 organizations that could help: the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory, Acadia National Park, Schoodic Institute, College of the Atlantic, and A Climate to Thrive. Our first meeting, which took place 15 months ago in person, set into motion a rewarding collaboration that both advanced the missions of each partner organization while allowing us to reach beyond our usual scope. Calling the project Landscape of Change, our collaboration faced several obstacles, a global pandemic being the most unexpected and challenging. Each partner had to decide how and where to devote limited resources, knowing our organizations faced budget challenges, the possibility of reduced staff, and the need to be nimble as the world shifted around us. We applied for grants that were ultimately redirected toward COVID relief. Yet we continued to meet and think creatively about how to achieve our goals on a limited budget. I cannot express enough my heartfelt gratitude for all of the time and knowledge and commitment that each of the partners brought to this process. We knew that Landscape of Change was going to be something different and something new. The chance to create a map layered with over 140 years of scientific data about birds, pollinators, seawater temperature, and climate. 2 new exhibitions that will open on the Somesville campus of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society in June, a series of public programs throughout the summer encouraging people to envision a resilient future, and new citizen science that will add to our picture of climate change. Landscape of Change explores the intersections of human and environmental history, past, present, and future. The strength of this collaboration is the new and immense outreach that's possible, engaging new audiences in citizen science, inspiring resiliency in the face of climate change, and creating a model for future analysis of how climate change is impacting the island and its waters. But this is only the beginning. Already, there are more partners asking to join the 4 areas of study that we began with. There are more categories that need mapping, and more analysis is needed to understand how extensive the damage is and what our opportunities are for change. History matters, but it only matters if you can access it, if you can read it, see it, feel it for yourself. And in this way, history becomes relevant. And once you see how history is relevant, it can serve to inspire. So tonight, as you hear more about how we are inspired, I hope you will be too. To tell you more about how to get involved, it's my pleasure to introduce the director of A Climate to Thrive, Lawson Wulsin.
Thanks, Raney, and thanks, Jerry, and thanks to everybody who is showing up tonight. It's really inspiring to see a broad group like this coming together to think hard, to reflect on the last, well, we'll find 140 years, give or take, and look forward to the next 140 or even further. My role tonight is to talk a little bit about sort of climate change and how it impacts our community, and why Climate to Thrive is sort of operates here on MDI. We're a small nonprofit with a mission to move MDI towards an energy independent future and a real focus on environmental sustainability and economic vitality. And we approach the climate crisis from I don't know, sort of many fronts at once, and that's because it's a complex challenge that faces our community, both small in our families and our neighborhoods and our towns, and our community large on a global scale. Let me first step back to just identify what we're talking about when I say climate crisis. What we're really talking about is the effect of human activity, specifically the burning of fossil fuels as a result of the Industrial Revolution and sort of modern society, which is built on an energy system that relies on burning of fossil fuels, which extract carbon from the earth and emits carbon, mostly carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. When we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, mostly that's carbon dioxide. And the more carbon in our atmosphere, the warmer our planet, or the less stable our climate. And so that climate crisis is really about an instability of weather patterns, and where you see increased storms, we see rising sea levels, longer droughts, and higher floods. And here on the coast of Maine, we see that on our seashores. We see that in our lobsters, who are moving further offshore as the water temperatures rise, and a lack of biological diversity, which we'll learn much more about from Catherine and Caitlin. I'm going to let the scientists talk more about the science, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the community part of this, the community resilience part of it. We are building a resilient community, and what that means is, Raney mentioned the nimbleness that we've needed in order to respond to the pandemic, and the climate crisis requires us to be nimble as well as a community to respond to the many changes that we're going to be confronted with on an annual and monthly, and every decade we're going to be confronted with new changes. We need a society that can be nimble and respond, react to those changes in a inclusive way, in a way that increases equity and justice and takes care of those who are most vulnerable. That requires all of us doing our part. And I'll offer three categories of ways to build resiliency in your community. The first has to do with paying attention and looking closely. And tonight we're going to hear a lot about people who came to MDI 140 years ago to pay attention. And it's helpful to remember that our role, that what they did 140 years ago has helped us understand our place in the world, and we can pay attention now to understand our place in the world. That paying attention isn't just about making observations of what birds you see at what time of the year, though that is really important. It's also about paying attention to how those observations make you feel. And so I think a lot of this, I also want to emphasize the importance of recognizing your own agency in controlling your relationship with your community and with your environment. The second part, so the first part is paying attention. The second part is making connections, because the climate crisis is a intersectional crisis. It affects all parts of society, all parts of our environment in an intertwined fashion. And so our ability to make connections is paramount. And it's about making connections between our observations today and our observations 140 years ago, but it's also about making connections between A Climate to Thrive and the Historic Society and the Biolab and Schoodic Institute and COA and the Acadia National Park. And it's about making connections between your family and your neighbor's family, because these collaborations are crucial to our ability to be resilient. And the more we're able to connect with each other, the more we're able to respond to changes. And then the third sort of avenue is taking action and getting involved. And it's about doing something. And the invitation is to think about your own life and what are ways that you can move your community, defined however large or small as you want, one step further. Every town in Maine has a climate action plan, has a comprehensive plan, which is not necessarily a climate action plan, but probably should be. And so my recommendation is to check out your town's comprehensive plan and get involved with that process. You can think about action on the state level. You can think about action on the local level, within your family or your church or your school, and think about ways that you can mitigate climate change. That means reducing the amount of carbon that you're emitting into the atmosphere, and ways you can adapt. And that means setting up systems that allow you to live a sort of environmentally sustainable life in response, while our environment is changing. So paying attention, making connections, and getting involved. Those are the three sort of pieces of advice. And it's okay if you don't want to do all three of them, or if you're not inclined to do all three of them at the same time. Doing this work requires figuring out what your passions are and leaning heavily into your passions. And there's a contradiction that I just want to invite you to hold, which is that it's important to do what you're really good at, and it's important to do what you don't know how to do. When we're fighting existential crises like climate change, it requires us to do things we don't know how to do and are uncomfortable with, as well as doing things we're expert at. And with that, I'm going to introduce Catherine Schmitt, who is an expert at communicating about science. She's a science communications specialist for the Schoodic Institute. Before that, she worked for the Maine Sea Grant program for many years. She's a writer and a journalist, and a historian who knows more about the Chabacco journals than probably just about anybody else. Catherine.
Thank you, Lawson. Thanks to the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory for hosting us this evening. I'm speaking to you from my home office in Bangor, Maine, which is the heart of Penobscot Nation territory. I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Champlain Society, but it's important to remember that they were not the first people to pay attention to the Mount Desert environment. And in fact, the Wabanaki people have been paying attention for thousands of years, and we also have a lot to learn from them. On March 31st, 1880, Harvard student Charles Eliot, his brother Sam Eliot, and a group of their friends gathered together in a Gray's Hall dormitory room in Harvard Yard. Charles Eliot proposed a summer camping expedition to Mount Desert Island, where his family had been vacationing since 1871. But in 1880, their father and stepmother were going to be away in Europe for the summer, and the boys had use of the family camping gear and sailboat. Now, a key part of Eliot's proposal for what became the Champlain Society was that each member do some work in some branch of natural history or science. Over the last almost decade now, I've talked a lot about the Champlain Society. I've told a lot of stories of these boys, and now because of Chabacco, you can read their stories. And so that's not going to be my focus tonight. Tonight, I'm going to talk about this natural history or science. And this is not something that I've presented in this way before. Upon their arrival at Camp Pometic on the shore of Somme Sound in Northeast Harbor, after a brief rainstorm, the Champlain Society began work on their specialties, establishing a weather monitoring station, collecting plants, and shooting birds. On any given day, Champlain Society members could be found dredging the mud of Somme Sound for marine invertebrates, climbing mountains in search of new plants, scouring the shoreline for rocks and fossils. Back at camp, as you can see in this photo here, they would be identifying the plants that they collected, stuffing birds that they shot, sketching and mapping their travels in notebooks and on a map of the island. This is just an excerpt here from that first summer of 1880 to give a sense for what a logbook entry looks like. The morning was occupied by Slade and photographing, by the Dunbars and analyzing flowers, while Spellman shot a great blue heron. In the afternoon, C. Elliott, Slade, and Orrin went to Southwest Harbor for mail and provisions. Spellman stuffed birds, a fine sunset. They used the latest textbooks, equipment, and methods of their time. A shotgun for birds, a vasculum for collecting plants. These are some of the reference manuals that we know from their logbooks that they used, and that's an image of a meteorological box or station that would have held instruments to measure humidity and temperature. Now, it was common for college students to travel to the woods and mountains of northern New England during their summer vacation. The Harvard Crimson newspaper noted in 1876 that the study and contemplation of nature after poring over books cannot fail to be enjoyable and refreshing. When the elder Charles William Eliot himself was a student at Harvard in the 1850s, he accompanied his chemistry professor on summer walking journeys throughout the Northeast. They collected rocks and visited mines, foundries, and metalworks. In 1858, a group of men, including James Russell Lowell, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Louis Agassiz, established the Philosophers' Camp in the Adirondacks, which is shown here in this painting by William James Stillman. But science was not typically a part of these vacation rambles, and the Champlain Society was fairly unique in this way. And they also represent what is sort of the end of the era of popular natural history. According to the scholar Sally Gregory Kolstedt, throughout much of the 1800s, efforts and concerns on behalf of science were really diffused throughout society. The pursuit of natural history was a characteristic recreation, especially among middle and upper classes, and including women. However, as College of the Atlantic's John Anderson has documented, the decline of natural history was underway by the 1890s. Only about a third of Harvard students were electing to take a natural history course in 1880. Science was becoming more specialized and more professionalized and less publicly accessible. And we can see this shift in how the Champlain Society divided themselves into what they called departments, as well as in the importance they placed on documenting their work. With varying membership, but Charles Eliot always their captain and Edward Rand their secretary, the Champlain Society returned to Mount Desert Island each summer throughout the next decade. Back at Harvard during the school year, they continued to meet regularly. They would share their reports from the summer's work. They would reminisce about past summer's work. They would look at photographs, and they would plan future seasons. They presented their findings before both the Boston and Harvard Natural History Societies. Their scientific efforts were really concentrated in the early years, 1880 through 1883. They emphasized adding new species to their lists, covering more ground and expanding to different subject areas or specialties, such as marine algae. Now, the camp logs, which are now published in Chabacco, are really the context for this data collection, providing clues about dates and locations. And what's unique about that is a lot of times we might have collections of specimens or we might have data, but we don't always have this context of the stories about who was there, where they went, and what else they were doing that day, even what the weather might have been. Collectively, their records serve as a baseline to understand environmental change. Individually, the work of the departments did vary. Some have already been incorporated by today's researchers, while others remain to be scrutinized. So I want to take a closer look at the different departments of the Champlain Society. Under the leadership of Sam Elliott, the Meteorological Department established a climate monitoring station at Camp Pametic, measuring temperature and humidity. They reported daily and weekly weather records in the camp log. The second year in 1881, they established stations at a couple different places around the island, including at the home of the Lunt family in Goose Cove, in Bass Harbor Lighthouse, Baker Island Light, and the Green Mountain House on Cadillac Mountain. Because they relied on boats for transportation, weather was really important to them, and there's a lot of additional details about climate in the camp logs. And just this past January, we at Schoodic Institute had a student intern who used their notebooks in a historical study of fog in and around Mount Desert Island. The geology department was led by Professor William Morris Davis, who was their teacher at Harvard and about 10 years senior to the student members of the Champlain Society. He was in the early stages of his career in 1880. He went on to become the founder of the field of geomorphology. And this is a page of his sketchbook showing notes about geology around the seawall area when he was with the Champlain Society. Geology department, Haliger DeWint presented their work before the Harvard Natural History Society, as we can see in this notice pasted into one of their logbooks. Professor Davis continued to attend Champlain Society meetings. He even hosted many of them at his house, and to work on the geology of Mount Desert Island. Champlain Society work was cited by Nathaniel Southgate Shaler in his U.S. Geological Survey report on the geology of Mount Desert in 1889. And then again in a chapter in Edward Rand's Flora of Mount Desert Island in 1894. Ichthyology, the study of fish, was led by Edward Rand. They fished for trout in ponds and streams, and some fishing sessions they'd catch 30 trout at one time. They would fish for flounder and spear flounders in Somme Sound. Rand wrote up the department's report in 1880, including a list of 31 species. And he included fish that were caught by commercial fishermen and landed at the docks. So they were paying attention not just to the fish that they were looking for, but what were other people catching and what was being landed. The collection of marine specimens was led by Charles Townsend, who was also part of the ornithology department. Townsend did not go to Mount Desert Island in 1881, but he returned in 1882 and continued his studies. The 1882 camp log describes him dredging often. He reported a total of 93 species of invertebrates. And his specimens, we have this note in one of the final notebooks of the Champlain Society, indicating that they were given to Henry Chapman of the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. And I think I have located some of them, but I have yet to travel down to Philadelphia to examine them, but hopefully sometime soon. And definitely stay tuned for more work on this subject by the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory, Schoodic Institute, Acadia National Park, College of the Atlantic, and other partners are working on some of this data. The ornithology department was led by Henry Spellman and Charles Townsend. In this log page, we can see Townsend hiking Brown Mountain, which is now Norumbega Mountain. And he is shooting a Nashville warbler, a white-throated sparrow, and a wild pigeon or passenger pigeon, which is a species that's now extinct. They, over the course of 4 years, they documented about 99 species. Robert Worthington and Julius Wakefield continued work and added notes to the original list in 1891. And then that list went into the hands of Francis Allen of the Portland Society of Natural History in 1900. And then he issued a longer list published by the Joint Path Committee of the Village Improvement Societies. And that list is now has found a home in the Acadia National Park archives, and their specimens of Spellman and Townsend are held by the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. The collection of insects was led by Roland Thaxter, who is the son of Levi Thaxter and Isle of Shoals poet Celia Thaxter. This logbook entry for August 22nd, 1880 describes Thaxter capturing the little yellow butterfly, Pterias lisa, now Eurema lisa, which at the time was the northernmost record for this species. While there is no report that we know of, some of Thaxter's specimens, including the very same little yellow butterfly, are at Harvard. The study of insects was greatly expanded upon in the 20th century by William Proctor, Auburn Brower, Charles Johnson, and others in the 1900s. Now, by far, the most comprehensive work of the Champlain Society was in the botany department under the leadership of Edward Rand, who produced annual reports, the cover of the first annual report you can see here, and a list of about 500 species through the year 1880. The 1883 report from the Botanical Department opens with a 15-page poem addressed to the goddess Flora, who is sitting serene on rosy hills. And in it, the Champlain Society really sort of pictures, is portraying themselves as faithful knights in the service of a beautiful queen. And here we have this call of scientific offerings, and sort of they come one by one before the goddess Flora and deliver their reports. And so this is a good time for me to hand over to Caitlin McDonough MacKenzie, who's a visiting assistant professor in environmental studies at Colby College and a second century stewardship fellow who has been researching the work in botany of the Champlain Society, and is going to provide us with an example of how we can use their science to study environmental change today.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me get my slides up in the famous little Zoom dance that we do now. And as Catherine mentioned, I've been working with the Champlain Society data for almost a decade, almost a decade now. I just want to echo Catherine before I dive into Edward Rand and the Botanical Department, just to acknowledge that this landscape it's the landscape of the Wabanaki people, the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, who spent thousands and thousands of years studying and working with the plants on this island long before Rand and his colleagues appeared. And I like to start off by thinking about the Champlain Society as my collaborators. And it's not just a set of old records that exists in a historical society, but it's really a living document. And I'm specifically interested in working with and talking about my work with Edward Rand, who was the head of the botany department. And while I never got to meet Edward Rand, this is the rock that is dedicated to him just outside the park on a little path down from Jordan Pond. And he's standing there with his vasculum, getting ready to do some collecting. And the work that Edward Rand put in during the 1880s and 1890s really made my research studying the impacts of climate change on Acadia National Park's plants possible. And I really appreciate how honest and open these records are, because I have things like understanding Edward Rand's kind of like existential angst about how as a curve ever approaches its asymptote, but never reaches it, so a flora ever approaches completion, but will never be complete. And so I have a photo here from the Harvard Herbaria Library, where Rand was keeping this working list, starting with the fieldwork in 1880, trying to catalog every plant on the island. And he was obsessed with this, but it wasn't just his personal obsession. He had this knack for bringing people in and along for the ride. And so as early as 1882, in one of the reports to the Champlain Society, he said that I would also suggest that we use every effort to interest every lover of Mount Desert in our work, whether by correspondence or personal appeal. And so he was really trying to reach out beyond the society itself to find other botanists and other plant enthusiasts on the island. And I've highlighted two of them here. The first is Annie Sawyer Downs in that very severe photo, not of her doing fieldwork. And she's first mentioned in 1880, I think the winter of 1887, 1888 in the Champlain Society report. And it includes this note that at Southwest Harbor, Miss Downs collected a number of specimens for the herbarium, mostly orchids. And she was a school teacher from Andover, Massachusetts, who summered on the island, and a very well-known botanist who both wrote extensively about botanical work. She had a magazine piece called How I Botanize. She presented to the Appalachian Mountain Club when they held a meeting on the island in the 1890s. But she's also just a fairly well-known Mount Desert Island historical figure. Her summer cottage still stands in Southwest Harbor. She's the founding or started the library in Southwest Harbor as well by just collecting paperbacks that tourists left behind and putting them on a shelf. And so she started working with Edward Rand in the late 1880s. And then John Redfield, he had been independently working on a catalog of Mount Desert Island's plants in 1882. And in 1888, Edward Rand kind of took over and all of the botanical work from the Champlain Society. At that point, most of the other Champlain Society members were, grown up, had graduated, and were off, building their own summer cottages, but not doing the scientific work every summer. And so at that point, Edward Rand and John Redfield consolidated their notes and began working together formally on a flora, where they wanted to publish this list of every plant on the island. And so Annie Sawyer Downs is cited over 25 times in the flora. She's the source for a whole suite of species, from a moss and a fern, 4 orchids, crowberry, catnip, skullcap, mint, a bellflower. And there's pressed plants in Harvard's herbaria that she collected with Edward Rand. And I really love to think about that, because she was 22 years older than Edward Rand, and John Redfield was 44 years older than Edward Rand. And so he created this kind of network of collaborators around himself. And in fact, after Edward Rand died, the New England Botanical Club listed 17 other taxonomists and specialists who helped Rand during the compilation of the flora. So that doesn't even include just the random folks that he met on the island during the summers, but who actually worked on the flora itself. And so he was really very much a collector of plants, but also a collector of people. And ultimately, this came together in a really wonderful volume that was published in 1894. That was the Flora of Mount Desert Island, a preliminary catalog of the plants growing on Mount Desert and the adjacent islands. So I just want to hold up my first edition copy of this preliminary catalog. If this is my preliminary catalog ever, that would be just amazing. But Edward Rand and John Redfield wrote in the preface to the catalog that it represents the final results of the work begun by the Champlain Society's Botanical Department. And it includes this introductory article that Catherine mentioned on the geology of Mount Desert Island. So that's the work of the Geological Department. And this is just a really wonderful, very thorough catalog of every plant on the island and its abundance in the 1880s and 1890s. And so I love to be a part of this and like think about the process that went into it. But it's not just that I think this is a wonderful document. It's the fact that it's this beautiful baseline data set. And I happened to stumble into it at exactly the right time. And so I arrived on Mount Desert Island in 2011 to start my PhD research. And really lucky for me, that was the same year that Glenn Mittelhauser and his colleagues put out the Plants of Acadia National Park, which is basically the 21st century version of Edward Rand's work with the Botanical Department. And just like Edward Rand was this really wonderful collaborator and very generous botanist who would go out in the field with anyone, to the point where actually my first edition copy, which my parents bought for me while I was doing my research, includes little footnotes in the margins where the guy who bought this book, H.M. Lynn in 1894, wrote that he went botanizing with Rand and they found mountain sandwort together in 1895. So just like Rand created that community, Glenn Mittelhauser, the first author of the Plants of Acadia National Park, is a similarly generous and wonderful colleague who, when I started my work trying to understand changes in these plant communities from 1894 to 2010, gave me the most amazing gift ever, which is not a first edition copy, but a photocopy of the first edition. And this is Glenn's personal copy that he then let me scan and photocopy so I could take his marginalia. So all of the green highlighting and the marginalia on the changes in nomenclature in the pages of this flora come from Glenn, who really helped me put together these two floras to understand changes from 1894 to 2010. And when we put those two books next to each other, we can really document how the community has changed on Mount Desert Island from the late 20th century or late 19th century through the early 21st century. And so this is called floristic change. This is when you reconstruct the plant diversity of the past and document extinctions and gains at a specific site. And so when we looked at floristic change on MDI, there's 730 species that were in the historic flora from 1894. And 106 of those species are now locally extirpated. So that's nearly 16% of the original flora, or the 1894 flora, which is now lost from the island. And another 231 species have declined in abundance. And we know this because Edward Rand and John Redfield wrote abundance notes on each of the species that are in here. And I'm going to share some of the actual language from that. And because Glenn Mittelhauser and his colleagues divided noted abundance by categories. So common, occasional, uncommon, and rare for each species in their flora. And I want to point out that this is something that Edward Rand was thinking about from the beginning. So in the very first report from the Botanical Department in the winter of 1881, the Botanical Department wrote, "It is, I think, not out of place in this report to call attention to the increasing rarity and eventual extinction of certain flowers on Mount Desert, and to consider the cause and whether it can be prevented in any feasible way." So there was already this understanding that the community was dynamic and that there was a risk that some of these species were becoming more rare. And we can see that in some of the species that have been lost or have declined in abundance on the island. So for example, Canada lily, which in 1894 was rare in Salisbury Cove, but very common on the mainland, is now extirpated on the island. And this is also true for low spike rush, which you can find on Schoodic, but is no longer on MDI or the Cranberry Isles. And we have species that have become less abundant. So this is rattlesnake plantain, or dwarf rattlesnake plantain, which in 1896, Annie Sawyer Downs wrote a letter to the magazine Gardens and Forests and described, "I found 2 interesting orchids abundant in woods and fields of Mount Desert in early October. The first is Goodyear repens, more commonly called the rattlesnake plantain, with curiously reticulated white-veined blue-green velvety leaves and slender greenish flower spikes and dainty cream-colored waxy flowers. The plants were thickly set among trailing snowberries, shining michellas, and yellowing ferns, and wearing that air of aloofness which distinguishes all orchids from the cheerful familiarity of asters and goldenrods." And so Rand had described 21 orchids in 1894. 9 of those species have disappeared from the island, and 8, including dwarf rattlesnake plantain, have declined in abundance. So it's no longer thickly set really anywhere. It's a rare plant on MDI. Similarly, we have plants like painted trillium, which were once frequent in damp woods and are now uncommon across MDI. And then it's not just that we're losing some of these native plants, but we also are gaining a lot of non-native plants. So while the historic flora included 730 species, there's 829 species today. It's just that many of those are non-native. So we've gained more species than we've lost, but we've gained a lot of non-native species. And so the kind of famous example of that is garden lupin, which in the Plants of Acadia in Glenn Middlehauser's book, they write, "Though locally beloved, this species is invasive in the Midwest and has invaded at least one wetland in our area." And it's not a species that Edward Rand would have encountered while doing field work with the Champlain Society, because it was not yet on MDI. And so when we think about species loss across the island and changes in plant communities over the last 140 years, one of the things that first came to mind was perhaps there's certain habitats that are losing species more rapidly than others. And so I looked across 6 habitat types on the island. I looked at aquatic and wetlands and the species that were growing there, coastal areas, are very slow to pop up here. Let's give those a second. There we go. And roadsides and disturbed areas and woods. And across all 6 of these habitat types, species loss is occurring. There's no one habitat that is losing proportionally more of their plant species. And so that points to a larger, more regional or global context driving species loss. And in fact, when we looked across the region, floristic change studies like the one that we did on Mount Desert Island, they're pretty common in New England. We have a lot of 19th century botanists who were collecting a lot of plant specimens or creating catalogs across the Northeast. We have a lot of late 20th century and early 21st century botanists who are like, this is really interesting. Let's find out what's changed and compare these 2 floras. And so I was able to put together a review of 13 sites across the Northeast where we've seen we have solid floristic change data. And what's really interesting about this is that there isn't a pattern. There's a huge amount of variety in how many species are lost from different sites, ranging from just 5 or 6% in the Finger Lakes up to close to 50% on Staten Island. And I ordered these by their conservation status. And so you can see that the darker bars are places that have protected status, either as, for example, on Mount Desert Island, a national park, state parks in the Mount Holyoke Range and Middlesex Fells, which is by the trustees of reservations here in Massachusetts. But basically across this range of 13 sites, it doesn't matter whether there's a conservation status or not. That's not helping us to explain this variation in species loss across these sites. And in fact, the more that I read about these other floristic change studies, the more that I really fell in love with Edward Rand and understood that our data here on Mount Desert Island is really special. It's special because we have this intention to document an entire flora. We know that's what Rand wanted to do. He says it over and over again in the Champlain Society logbooks. We have voucher specimens from the fieldwork. So we have the herbarium specimens that we can go and look at Harvard Herbaria and double check what Rand was doing. So was he correct when he said that this was Trillium, or did he have it confused with a different Trillium? We have the field notes from his fieldwork, so we know what kind of survey effort he put into it and where he was on the landscape. He published his flora. So not only do we have this wonderful complete volume, but we also have the correspondence that he received from other botanists. And we know how the flora was received in the botanical community. And in fact, he received really lovely letters from botanists and scientists across the United States in the wake of the publication. And so we know how this stands up to contemporary feedback. These are kind of the gold standard for historical botanical work, and we don't see it anywhere else that we have this floristic change study across the Northeast. And so I think the variation that we see in species loss across these other sites is not because there's something special about any one of those sites, but because there's something really special about the baseline data that we have here on Mount Desert Island. And so I want to kind of close by coming back to this rock where I talked to Edward Rand and really acknowledge and thank him for the incredible amount of effort that went into that data set. Because I don't know that he really meant it to become a study in how plants are responding to climate change, but he definitely intended for it to be used in a scientific context. And I really hope that I can live up to Rand's commitment to collecting both plants and people, and to contribute to this community of botanists here on MDI, and to work with plant ecologists and plant lovers and leave behind these detailed records of our work and the process that was behind it, so that future botanists and ecologists can use our records the same way that I've been able to use Edward Rand's. And so I want to end just by pointing out that it's not just me. I had a lot of help doing this work over the years, both from my lab in grad school at Boston University, but also from Acadia National Park and the broader community on MDI. And I think one of the most wonderful things about this whole process was getting to basically find my community of people the same way Edward Rand did when he was working with the Champlain Society. So thank you so much. And I'm going to send this back to Catherine.
Thank you, Caitlin. So change is happening very fast, and we can't, and it's happening everywhere at once. And we really can't rely on researchers like Dr. McDonough MacKenzie alone. We really need all of us to contribute if we're going to understand the impacts of climate change. The Champlain Society knew this, and everybody was encouraged to contribute. So in his botany, Rand stressed the importance of paying attention. Use your eyes, he wrote. Make a note of what you see when on the island and send in the results of your observations. Sam Elliott too stressed the importance of individual work and investigation. He called upon every member and friend of the society to become an observer. Observations such as I have mentioned cannot be carried on by a single observer, he wrote. They must be carried on by a number of observers stationed all over the island. It will not be much trouble to note the time of the arrival of a fog bank at some particular spot, or to take the temperature of the air and water at some particular hour. And if these simple observations can be carried on at the same time and at all parts of the island, the result cannot fail to be interesting. This is a changing landscape. The Champlain Society and other scientists in the 20th century, such as William Proctor, have given us baselines from which we can measure change. But we really need help. We need data from the present now to compare with the past. And so we're inviting you to revisit historic survey sites on Mount Desert Island and to help contribute new observations of bees, of birds, of butterflies, of moths. We want you to do this using readily available applications like iNaturalist and eBird, and really join us in what we're hoping is going to be a new summer of science and wonder. Jasper White is a student at College of the Atlantic, and he's been working with Gordon Longsworth of the College of the Atlantic GIS Laboratory, and they have mapped some of the Champlain Society data. And Jasper now is going to show us this tool that you can all use to help us document Mount Desert Island's landscape of change and hopefully experience your own summer of science and wonder. Jasper, you're up.
Hi. So I'm Jasper White. I am, as Catherine said, a student at the College of the Atlantic, and it's so fascinating to be of the age of these people who came up to this land and explored and documented what was here. And so it's really been fascinating to be looking through their specimens and putting them in this new format that they could never have imagined, and bringing it into a space where the public can not only look at it, but also contribute. And so I've been working with Geographic Information Systems, GIS software, to put these specimens using the location data that was collected by the Champlain Society, Proctor, and a few other collectors into maps that are easy for the public to explore and later contribute to. So you may be wondering, how did I get involved in this? The College of the Atlantic was asked to have someone help with this project. And we have a really excellent GIS professor, Gordon Longsworth, who reached out to me because my work study at the school is with the George B. Dorr Museum of Natural History. So I work preparing specimens, recataloging, organizing, and more recently, mapping these specimens. So I decided to do my final project in the GIS course on laying out foundationally just where these specimens were collected. And they're donated from all over New England. And so it was really interesting. You can see on the right, this map that I created as my final project to show where these specimens came from. And so Gordon thought, well, this is perfectly in line with what we're looking for the Landscape of Change project. So he asked me to do that. And so we can see, delving really into the individual specimens, I think it's really interesting when we look at such a vast problem such as climate change to focus in on one individual that can help us learn more. So as we go through, we're going to follow this monarch butterfly. The species, the genus is Denois Plexipus, and this was collected by William H. Proctor. So as we come through, the first step is to take the data that's set into these specimens written on little tags and put that into a digital software. So we're literally bringing this past information into the future, into this new technology that the people who collected this never could have imagined. So here we have this monarch butterfly collected September 23rd, 1933, Denois Plexipus by William Proctor at Seawall. So this mapped location column is what I'm really interested in, is getting all of these points, specifically where they were found, so that we can visualize exactly where these collectors were working and eventually use that to compare where these specimens and these species were, where their range maps existed, to where they are now. So I bring it into here. This is my workspace in the ArcGIS software. And what I do is I look at that column, the map location, put down a point, and then bring in that whole data set, merge it to those points. So basically what I'm doing is giving them a space based on just these words that before had no geographic information in them. So, so we look at this point, and this is what you will be working in. So when you visit the Landscape of Change website that we've created, the map will look just like this. It's embedded in there. So you'll just click on it and you can zoom around you can click on individual points and it will give you a bar like this that will give you all of that information that Catherine has spent so much time translating from the logbooks. So we see here that this point is mapped at seawall, but if we look at this label up here, it says seawall here. So you may ask, why is that not up there? And again, it all goes back to these logbooks. So here we have a passage about sea cucumbers, and we've already seen many passages about the various conditions in which the Champlain Society was collecting, but also there's a lot of information in there about where their camps were and exactly what part of the island they were on. So we really strive for accuracy in these points. And if there's anything we can do to make those clearer in exactly where they were collecting, as opposed to where we think they might have been collected, based on, especially current maps can be very misleading about where exact locations are. So as I said, once you get into that site, it will look just like this. On the side, it's pretty straightforward, and we've added a lot of information for you to, for it to be even clearer for how to navigate that. So you'll be prompted when you hover your mouse over the map to click anywhere, and that will put you inside of the embedded map to start exploring. It'll give you the option to zoom in, to move the map around, and to start clicking on these points to find out where species were located when the Champlain Society and Proctor were documenting them, observing them, and collecting them. Over here, we can see the layer list. This is each of these layers, go to the next slide, are individual collections of points. So everything is color coded, but you can also turn it on and off within this layer list. So we have the 1900 bees collected by Proctor are in pink. So that's that pink layer, and you can decide to turn that on or off. Currently, they're in frequency bubbles. So that's a larger bubble for how many points are in that given space. Whereas when you zoom in, they become these more individual points that you can then click on, get information about each specific specimen. And you might wonder, why are these all clustered together? Did the Champlain Society go out and say, okay, this is a great field of flowers that these pollinators, because blue, pink, and red are all pollinator points, purple are the bird points. Were these pollinators drawn here by a great cluster of flowers? Sadly, we don't know the exact information for every single point. So we have discussed many, many times what the best solution for this is. So every point here is labeled as Mount Desert Island. We want to include them because we want to show that they are on Mount Desert Island, but we can't say for certain exactly where. So we don't want to provide any false information, but by clustering in this method, we can show what's in this general area. And sadly, there is no further information on those, but they're here and you can explore them. And many, many of these points, Catherine and I have spent hours making sure that they're in precisely the exact location. So these are the anomalies, and they're still here for you to explore and know what was on the island. Sorry about that. So this is the base map gallery over here. It's another one of these icons. We have the legend will tell you what the points mean. The layer list lets you select between those 4 color-coded layers that I had just mentioned, 3 of which are pollinators, 1 of which is birds. And this is the base map gallery. It lets you choose whatever kind of picture you want in the background. So here we have colored pencil map, looks kind of like a kid's menu at a restaurant if you prefer to look at these specimens in that format. It's really, this whole program is up to how you want it to appear. So you can choose the layers you're looking at, you can choose the map you're looking at. And here automatically what we've set you up with is a map created by Edward L. Rand, which is a name we're all pretty familiar with at this point. Who's part of the Champlain Society, and in 1893 he designed this map that we are looking at these points upon. So that's also a layer in the layer list that you can turn on and off. If you want to change your base map, you're going to have to turn off the Rand map, but I think it's really applicable to these points because it was created by one of the people collecting this information. Another thing about these old maps is they can tell us where points are. So there was this bank swallow that I was looking for, and I had it on it said Somes Sound on the map location area. So I plotted it around here, and then I checked in with Catherine. I said, does this seem right? We both agreed, maybe it's right, but maybe not. And so Catherine checked the logbooks, came back to me about a week later and said, no, that's actually on Fernald Point. And so when I look up Fernald Point, if you look it up right now on Google Maps, it doesn't exist. Google Maps is very confused as to where Fernald Point is. But if I look at that RAND map, it's best to just consult the people who were collecting these points. We can see Fernald Point really clearly right here. And so eventually that bank swallow wound up on Fernald Point right there. But I really want to emphasize, it's not only the names that are changing, as Catherine already pointed out, over here on Brown Mountain, which is now Norumbega Mountain, lots of names are changing, but also the species that are present are changing. And we can see that directly with this map. So you might recognize the passenger pigeon. They went extinct in 1914 due to farmers hunting them across the United States, but they were once supposed to black out the sky because their flocks were so numerous. And they made a great food source for a while until there were none left. And so it's really special that we have this information to show that, okay, we had passenger pigeons on Mount Desert Island, and we had all these other species too that have slowly been either in decline or might still be around, and we can see exactly where they were seen. This map also tends to show us where the Champlain Society was camping. So here we have Camp Astiku, over here we have Camp Hemetic, and you can see there's big clusters of specimens in those areas, and also certain trails they would take the day they went up Brown or Norumbega Mountain. So it's really special that we have these places, that we have this information that we can look at directly, and it's now open to the public. This is the map that you'll be looking at if you go to the Landscape of Change website. You can explore all of these individual points, and hopefully at our April 25th gathering at Sur de Mont, which I think we've mentioned and we'll talk about more, we can all become part of this. And so the specimens that you're mapping using eBird and iNaturalist will then be added to this map and similar maps so that we can directly explore what we're finding today with what was found in the 1880s, which is incredible to have 140 years of information on a single map that we can then use to compare how anthropogenic climate change is affecting nature. Thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you to all of the other presenters.
Wow, that's
Wonderful.
a lot. That's great. Go ahead, Raney.
No, I was just going to say thank you and start. Lawson and I are going to together sort of monitor and work through questions. We've got people that have been posting into the chat, so I'll just say really quick and then let Lawson keep going. If you do have questions, you can add them to the chat. I do notice there's some people putting their hands up, but because the volume of or the number of people that are here, I'll encourage you, instead of asking you to speak directly, just type your question in the chat and we'll handle answers through that. So please go ahead and do that. And then Lawson, if you want to.
Great. Yeah. So while I'm going to populate the chat with a couple of other things too. So it might get a little noisy in there. That's all right. First, I'm going to go ahead and throw a link in there for people who want to check out our website. The Landscape of Change website is live today. You can look at the maps that Jasper just walked you through. And we'll include this in a follow-up email. So you don't have to do that right now. That's fine, but I want to, you can click on that and like have it open in the background and come back to your Zoom meeting. The other link I'm going to share is for a survey. This is a collaboration between 6 entities on MDI, and where we want to try to understand who is in the room. There's 120 right now. We were up to 145 at one moment, I think, or 144 maybe. And so it's helpful to understand who we're reaching tonight. And it's also part of a much bigger project. It's going to continue this summer into the fall, and we want to your feedback. And so I'm going to put another link into the chat. Copy this, paste that in the chat. So that's a survey that we would love for you to fill out tonight if you can. It helps us plan for the future and understand who's here. Jasper mentioned an event on Sunday, and Catherine talked about citizen science, and Jasper showed us an amazing map. And now it's your turn to help us populate that map. And it starts with a bio blitz on Sunday. It's April 25th. We're going to meet at Stewardship right in Acadia National Park, and we're going to walk through the trails, and you'll have an opportunity to test out eBird and iNaturalist and do some of these observations to be able to, spend the day with Edward Rand and others. And so I'll put that link in the chat. Where's that one? And you don't really need a link for that. There's not a registration. You just show up, but it's a good reminder. This is a useful reminder for folks who want to come out between 9 and 1. It's an open house, so there's no like start time or there's no like point at which we're going to gather together. Everyone will be wearing masks, and we'll keep our distance but get to connect in person, and then you can head out onto the trails. There'll be a couple sort of suggested walks about ways you could go, places you could go, and things you might notice while you go.
Great. So thank you. I hope we'll get to see a lot of people with us on Sunday. You'll be able to hear from all the partners and ask us more questions, and then be able to get involved with this project. I'm going to go to some of the questions we have in the chat. Catherine, first one's for you. Did the Champlain Society members express a love of place in any of their journals? I'm interested in how emotion, aesthetics stimulated or reinforced their decisions about where to spend their time studying natural history.
Thank you. The answer to that question is absolutely. And the evidence is right in the logbooks themselves. I gave a little one verse from one poem, and there's a lot of poems. They even had a poet who was a member, John McGow Foster, who joined them for several years. So they sort of had, poetry was part of their science. And in the poems, you can see their sense of place, and you can see their sense of place in those meetings that they held during the fall and winter when they would get together, and you can see that sort of reminiscing and the memories of the summer. In previous talks that I've given about the Champlain Society, I talked about their age, and there's something that's very impressionable about being 18, 19, 20 years old. And if you combine that sort of impressionable age with being in a very beautiful place and then doing something like science, which is very intensely focused, all of that sort of creates this sense of place. And it's more than a sense of place, because that's what actually led them to advocate for conservation of what became Acadia National Park.
We answered a little bit of this question in the chat, but I will share it just for those who haven't had a chance to read it. Is there documentation or stories from the Wabanaki about observations of climate change? And are you aware of any efforts to collaborate with the nation about stewardship? And so I answered that, yes, the National Park is working with Wabanaki leaders to, especially working on plant species, to reintroduce native sustainability and traditional knowledge into plant management and harvesting. So that will be featured as part of the exhibits that open on June 24th at the Soamesville campus for the Historical Society. A lot of traditional stories do talk about change over time prior to European contact, and so those are available in a variety of forms. And then Catherine, you had an additional link that you shared in the chat that you can explain as well.
Sure. So we recently held a session of the Acadia National Park Science Symposium that was focused on Wabanaki science knowledge and perspectives. And so you can hear more about these partnership projects at that recording of that event.
Question, Caitlin, this one might be for you or Catherine. How much of the decline of flora might have to do with the Great Fires of 1947?
Anecdotally, we only know of one species that was lost, it's a complete anecdote. Mountain laurel was said to be on the island before the fire and has not been seen since the fire. So yeah, we don't have a very good sense of if there's hidden losses from the fire. And I'm sure it certainly had an impact on abundances of plant species. And we see that especially in terms of when you look at the side of Cadillac today and you can see the fall colors, where before it was definitely spruce fir. So it's changed the abundance of deciduous trees along those slopes. I think overall, the fact that we have those two time periods that are so far apart, we're not able to trace any one species through time with the precision to be able to make statements about why any one taxa became more or less abundant or locally extinct. And so in bringing together more of a community science partnership, maybe we can start to get that really fine scale detail to trace some of these changes going forwards.
Caitlin, while you're there, I have another question for you. You mentioned the presence of orchids. Are there remaining orchids on the island? And maybe you can talk a little bit more about those.
Yeah, so the dwarf rattlesnake plantain is still on the island. It's just more rare than it used to be. Lady slippers are still on the island. You can hike down the south ridge of Cadillac and find them right by the feather bed. I see them there every year. And ladies' tresses are still on the island. So there are still orchids. They're just not as abundant and they're not as diverse as they used to be on the island. And I think that's a trend that we've seen across the Northeast in all of these floristic change studies. And I think the reason why we see that trend is not because orchids are especially more vulnerable, although they might be, but because orchids are especially beautiful and people like to collect them. And so we know a lot about the historic abundances and presence of orchids in all of these places. And so it's really obvious when we lose an orchid because people care about them so much.
Either Catherine or Caitlin, at what time in history do you consider something native? So how far back does a plant have to be here to be considered native?
So I'm actually a paleoecologist, and so I could tell you that nothing is native because everything was under ice 16,000 years ago. And any plant that you see here on the island has traveled a long way to get here. But in terms of looking at, for example, Rand and Redfield's flora, we're using native as basically white settlers on the island and their first accounts of what was there versus things that we know appeared over the last century. We know there are some species on the island in the 1894 flora that had escaped from cultivation, because 1894 was not like everything before that was, without development on the island. There was plenty of farms, there were quarries, there were sawmills. And so there's plenty of plants on the island in 1894 that were still considered not native to the island at that time. And so we're basically using Rand's perspective to draw that line.
Catherine, what do we know about species from the observations of locals during times of the year when the Champlain Society was not around?
Yeah, that was a great question. So we know a lot from anyone who might have been fishing or farming or logging and happened to keep records or notes or share through oral history knowledge of what was on the island. And things like fishing logbooks have been used before to study changes in sort of fisheries of the Gulf of Maine, for example. But really, if we look at the data that's akin to the data that we have from the sort of summer scientists, the year-round data really picks up around the 1930s. So after the establishment of Acadia National Park, and the park gets its first naturalists, and they start documenting what's out there and issuing reports, the series of nature notes. And also the Christmas bird count started on Mount Desert Island in the 1930s. And so we started to see a lot more of that activity in terms of giving us data that's comparable to what the Champlain Society provided us with.
Next question. I believe that MDI was quite barren in places at the turn of the century from logging and farming. Now there's been a lot of reforestation. What would that be a factor in the changes to the species that we're seeing?
Yeah, we definitely expected that open grasslands would be losing more species because there's been a kind of contraction of that habitat space. There's been more woods and forests growing into places that were culturally open when Rand and Redfield were doing their botanical work. And so that was one of the surprising results when we looked at it by habitat category, that there was no significant relationship between the habitat type and species loss or species decline. And again, this is really a really broad analysis. We looked at 6 categories, and obviously you can like drill down and be much more specific about natural communities. And you can also, if you could, follow any one species through time to understand why it's becoming more or less abundant. But at this really broad scale, we just didn't see a difference that we had kind of expected to see. We also expected, that roadsides and disturbed places would be harboring more species, but they're losing species just as rapidly as other locations. So it's kind of a mystery that we're still untangling.
We have a question about pronunciations, that traditionally it's understood that the island customarily might have been pronounced Pematic, but the evening it's been called Pemetic. And so there's a question about the change or the pronunciations being used.
That's probably just my fault. That's just how I say it. And I think that's one of the traditional, that was an original Wabanaki term for the island. And so we should probably look to them for the right pronunciation, but I'll just, apologize. That's just my personal affectation.
Let's see, we're getting some thank yous. Can we save the chat on the computer app? There's some questions about that. Let's see. Jerry mentions that they'll also send everyone a follow-up email with all of the links. Let's see, are there any known records of freshwater fish species on MDI after the Champlain Society?
Yes, we have very good records of fish. And there was a great article in Chabaco, I think 2017, maybe, about freshwater fish conservation on Mount Desert Island and in the region. So I can find the link to that and post it.
Have there been any studies of mycorrhizal fungi distribution on MDI that might explain some of the loss of orchids or other species from associations with the fungi?
Not that I know of, but I do know that Robert Burton, one of the botanists who is working on Worcester and Worcester County floristic change, is starting to put together a research team to tackle orchid loss across the Northeast. So that might be a part of future research.
I was asked how the MDI Historical Society came into the possession of the Champlain Society journals as an important piece of our history. And we're very grateful for deep relationships with the Elliott family descendants who shared those resources with the Society, knowing that we would be able to take care of them. We've also had them transcribed. So in addition to the 3 years that you can find in this year's edition of Chabaco, you can actually get on our website or through Main Memory Network and see the full transcriptions of all the journals, both from the camps, and then also we have some of the ship's logs in the collection as well. So, so those are, we're grateful for the trust placed in the Historical Society by the Elliott family descendants to be able to care for and make those accessible. Let's see, I got that one already. Well, some thank yous, fish article. How do you think your research may help protect our Frenchman Bay against recent interest in industrial aquaculture? What is the salmon history? Catherine, that might be a question for you.
Yes, I don't know if the person who asked that knows that I also have a book out about salmon. So there are certainly salmon rivers to the Isle of Ho and Penobscot Bay would be along a salmon migration route. And there are salmon rivers to the east of Frenchman Bay, but really salmon need big rivers. They need to get up into the watershed. So no specific history about salmon from Mount Desert Island or sort of the Frenchman Bay region proper, although there's a couple mentions. They might have been like accidentally caught in nets by people who are fishing for other species, but there wasn't sort of an established run here. However, I think, and this relates to some other questions that were asked around the same time, Marine invertebrates are something, so the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory, they've got records that we're currently trying to get on the map. And there's, and Proctor, who surveyed a lot of the insects. So we were able to map his insect data sets, but he's got huge data sets on marine invertebrates. And there's a team of people who are going to be out resampling some of that Frenchman Bay data this summer. And so hopefully, I think that looking at the change and getting out there and observing and paying attention to Frenchman Bay is something that that we can do to help us all understand what is the state of the bay and how is it changing. And that's going to inform how we address proposals for major aquaculture sites or any other kind of proposals for uses that may affect the water and the animals and plants in the bay.
We had it, that tags into another invertebrate marine question and mapping. And so I would just echo that we barely scratched the surface. When this group met together in February or March before the pandemic shut everything down in person, we had a discussion about the breadth of information that we were going to be tackling, and very intentionally decided to go a little more narrow because we wanted it to be a successful project that our nonprofits, which we also have other work that we do, could actually achieve. And then the goal with that achievement was to make it replicable so that we can start folding in additional partners and other layers of information. And so that I'm hopeful is going to be one of the next phases of growth for this partnership that we've formed through here. Caitlin, we have some questions on invasive species and what kinds of invasive species are causing some of the most trouble on MDI.
Oh, that's a great question. That I'm not an invasive plant biologist, but I do know that Acadia National Park's invasive species or invasive plant team has been doing a lot of work on that. And so I really defer to them because I don't want to speak out of turn. I know they do excellent work.
We had a question on when the next Chibako edition will start appearing in mailboxes. So if you're a member of the Historical Society, it's already in the mail and on the way to you. And if you want to see this year's edition of Chibako, I will be happy to take a membership from you over the phone or on our website, and we can send it to you. I did not plant that question, I promise. How can we stay in touch with Professor MacKenzie and your work, as well as all of the other work that's being presented here?
I'll put my website in the chat, and I plan on sticking around for as long as possible.
And I would say through our website, so the new Landscape of Change website that was just launched today, that this presentation is celebrating, has all of our contact information on there as well. Somebody wants to know, are there any current DNA barcoding projects with marine verts or with plant species?
I can answer that. Yes, there have been. So we had Schoodic Institute had a second century stewardship fellow in 2016 who looked at environmental DNA, specifically looking at some fish passage projects. And there's also been work on forest soil DNA and looking at the microbial community there. Those data are not yet available, but there has been some work, and there's going to be some work on turtles this summer. So it's definitely a growing area, and I think the park probably anticipates future research projects using environmental DNA as well.
That takes us past our time and through our questions. I'm going to just toss it back to Jerry for the last word, and just thank you all so much for your interest. I look forward to seeing you hopefully on Sunday if you're in the area, and if not, check back through the Landscape of Change website or any of our websites to find out for more events and programs and the different things that are going to be taking place throughout the season. And I hope you get outside and start documenting your observations. Thanks to all our speakers, and Jerry, I'll let you have the last word.
Absolutely. And I just want to echo that. Thank you all so much for your time and attention this afternoon. We did put a quick promo for our next Science Cafe, which is about rainforest. So switching gears, we hope you'll consider joining us. And in the meantime, absolutely, we are so excited about what's to come for this project. And we really look forward to receiving your feedback and helping us guide how this project moves forward. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.